Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. Well, today marks the third episode in our third series of Way of the Fathers. In the first series, we got to know the Fathers themselves. In the second, we studied the Church's first 7 ecumenical councils. Now we're exploring the cities in which the Fathers lived and served. Our last time together, we traveled the streets of Jerusalem. Now we're moving 300 miles north, and we're making our first foray into Gentile territory. We're going to Antioch. So let's imagine we're travelers from some far-off land, and we're coming to see Antioch for the first time. We've been walking the weary road for long hours, and we didn't finish our journey before dark. But as we approach from the hills of the north, luxurious suburban villas line the road, and we make our way from one pool of light to the next. And then we see it. Bright stripes of light spread out below us. We've heard stories of the lights of the big city, and we thought they must be exaggerated. They weren't. Every street is lined with lights, and the walls blaze with illuminations. As we come in through the city gate, we can't help admiring the Titanic walls, more ornamental than useful, as it would turn out, but definitely calculated to be impressive. And then the bustle inside. People rushing here and there, laughing, gossiping, shopping, as if it were the middle of the day. Most of them are speaking Greek, but it doesn't take long for us to hear a group speaking in our own language. We make our way over and politely introduce ourselves. Have we come in the middle of a festival? We ask. No, our new friends tell us. Antioch is always like this. And they eagerly fill us in on the wonders of the city. The street lights. They're very proud of the public street lighting. The colonnades that line the main streets and keep shoppers cool in the midday sun and dry in the rain. The great church donated by Constantine himself, the palaces, the theater, the hippodrome. But if you really want to go home with a memory for a lifetime, they tell us, come to the great church on Sunday morning and hear that young fellow John preach. That's an experience you'll never forget. There's a reason they call him the man with the golden mouth. Antioch was founded about 300 years before Christ by one of Alexander the Great's generals. The Macedonian Alexander had conquered the world, which is to say, most of the places the Greeks knew or cared about. But he died at the age of 32, and his vast empire immediately fell apart. His best generals each seized as much as they could get their hands on, and the one who ended up with Syria and the surrounding area was Seleucus. When he had time to take a break from fighting everybody else, he founded a new capital city and named it for his father, Antiochus. Seleucus had won his kingdom with the help of Jewish mercenaries, and he encouraged some of them to settle in the new capital. From the beginning, according to Josephus, they were full citizens, as much so as the Greeks Seleucus brought in to make the city an outpost of Greek civilization. By the time of Christ, the Jewish quarter in Antioch was large and prosperous. Herod the Great, with his usual taste for extravagant building, gave the Jewish quarter a beautiful stone-paved shopping street with colonnades down both sides. Antioch was outside his dominion, but Herod's gift sent the strong message that he was the benevolent leader of the whole Jewish world. It may also have indicated a more cynical calculation, that the Jews of Antioch were rich and important enough that he needed to keep on their good side. For most of the history of ancient Antioch, the Jewish community remained large and important, even well into Christian times. It was influential enough that many Greeks in Antioch were attracted to the Jewish religion. They became proselytes, the God-fearers as they were called, who had not yet become fully Jewish, but came to the synagogues and heard the scriptures. Luke tells us that the deacon Nicolaus was a proselyte from Antioch. He also tells us that when the disciples were scattered after the martyrdom of Stephen, Antioch was one of the places they went. At first, they had been preaching only to Jews, but in Antioch they started preaching to Gentiles as well. Paul and Barnabas spent a year teaching in Antioch, and it seems they were so successful in making converts that Antiochians needed a word to describe those people. As Luke tells us, in Antioch, the disciples were for the first time called Christians. For the next 5 centuries, Antioch would be one of the most important centers of Christian thought, and it developed its own style of thinking about Christianity. From the beginning, the Christian thinkers of Antioch would focus on the literal sense of Scripture. That would lead some of them to become some of the greatest Christian teachers who ever lived. It would lead others to found some of the most persistent and dangerous heresies. The first great name that comes up among Christian leaders from Antioch is St. Ignatius of Antioch. In the early 100s, a time when there were still many people alive who had known the apostles, he was sent off to martyrdom in Rome, and along the way he wrote a series of letters to encourage Christians in other churches. The letters are inspiring and instructive, and one of the things they teach us is how important the church in Antioch had already become. Ignatius writes politely to all the churches, but he writes as if he had a right to teach them something. Only to the church in Rome does he write as if he were deferring to a superior. The next big name in Antioch is Theophilus, bishop of Antioch in about 170 AD, who wrote a defense of Christianity against the pagans, a work that still survives. Christianity was a big deal in Antioch even before the Emperor Constantine made the Christian religion legal in the year 313. As the church grew, many Christians, men and women, decided to devote themselves completely to the Lord. Many of those retreated from the distractions and temptations of the city and went out into the wilderness. By the 300s, there were so many of them that they formed a second city of their own on Mount Silpius, outside the city, one that looked more like a military camp than the sophisticated urban metropolis they had left. John Chrysostom, we'll hear more about him soon, describes a desert full of monks' huts laid out one after another, with the monks leading simple but worry-free lives. Considering the cares of the big city, the ascetic life in the hills had a strong appeal. As John said, "They have no reason to be gloomy when evening has overtaken them, as many men feel, worrying over the anxious thoughts that spring from the evils of the day. After their supper, they have no reason to be careful about robbers, and to shut the doors, and to put bars against them. Nor do they have to dread the other ills of which many are afraid, extinguishing their candles with strict care, for fear that a spark anywhere should set the house on fire. Robbers and fires, 2 of the biggest worries of life in the big city, and even when you're not worrying about those, you have 1,000 other things to worry about." As it turned out, one of those things was the state of the church itself. The church in Antioch was often in turmoil, and more than once it had multiple bishops all claiming to be the only legitimate bishop. The school of Antioch, which gave birth to great exegesis, great scriptural interpretation, also gave birth to more than one notorious heresy. Not every bishop of Antioch was on the right side of the heresy line. Paul of Samosata was a bishop of Antioch who began teaching a radical interpretation of the Incarnation. According to him, Jesus was just a human being who was really, really good. Jesus was inspired by the Word of God, but was not the Word himself. What made Paul's heresy so dangerous was that he was a great entertainer. He preached homilies that had the crowds cheering and clapping. This was normal practice, by the way. Christians applauded their preachers the way they would applaud orators in the forum or actors on the stage. These preachers were the rap stars of their age. And heresies often began with great preachers. The biggest heresy of them all started in Antioch. Arius had come to Antioch to study with St. Lucian, one of the best-known Christian teachers there. It was after he returned to Alexandria that he began teaching the false doctrine that the Son of God was a created being, not co-eternal with the Father. So although the Arian heresy really belongs more to Alexandria, the germ of it came from Antioch. In the year 313, the Emperor Constantine finally made Christianity legal. As we know, the church didn't live happily ever after. Instead, with the church becoming a route to power and influence, the question of which doctrine was the right one and who was the right bishop became much more hotly contested. And the pagans had not conceded defeat. That was important because in the year 361, one of Constantine's nephews, Julian, became emperor and suddenly announced that he was a pagan. Future historians would call him Julian the Apostate. Immediately, Julian started trying to undo Christianity. And in 363, the news came in. He was coming to make his headquarters at Antioch. Antioch had a long pagan tradition, and it was the home of Libanius, the most admired literary figure among the remaining pagans, and the most famous professor of rhetoric in the whole empire. So Julian came to Antioch with high hopes of making it the capital of his new Hellenism. He was doomed to disappointment. The citizens of Antioch didn't take him seriously. They laughed at his beard. Julian was very vain about his beard, and they laughed at it. Julian left Antioch in a sour mood. Then he was killed in Persia, so it didn't matter much how he felt about Antioch. What Julian had discovered was that it was too late for Antioch, too late to make the city into a pagan capital. Antioch was Christian. There were still pagans in the city, but they were irrelevant. Even the famous rhetorical school of the belligerently pagan Libanius was turning out the next generation of great Christian thinkers. And of all the Christian thinkers who came out of Antioch, the most famous by far is St. John Chrysostom, John the Golden-Mouthed. John was raised by a single mother, though fortunately she had money. She was able to pay for the best education money could buy, so John ended up in the rhetorical school of Libanius, where he was the star pupil. But John had been raised a Christian, and his Christian faith pulled him more and more toward the church. Ordained as a priest, John began preaching, and right away he was a star. All that stuff he had learned from Libanius worked just as well in a Christian homily as it did in a classical oration. The crowds went wild. They clapped and cheered. They laughed at the jokes. John half-heartedly told them they should sit quietly and listen, but when he said that, they clapped and cheered even more. And John loved it, as he confessed. The church was a big deal in Antioch by John's time. John describes how it had hospitals and homes for the aged and hostels for travelers. Much of what would be done by the government today was done by the church. There was even a time when the church managed to save the city from complete annihilation. It started when the Emperor Theodosius imposed new taxes that seemed burdensome to the mob in Antioch. A riot followed. Now, riots were common in ancient cities, and they weren't a big deal most of the time. But this time, the rioters got carried away and pulled down the statues of the emperor and his family, dragging them through the streets like criminals. That was going too far. The statues were the imperial family's presence in the city. So this was treason. When the people sobered up, they realized they were in trouble, the kind of trouble that could lead to a massacre of thousands and the whole city being leveled to the ground. In those dark days, John preached a series of sermons that no one who heard them ever forgot. He didn't conceal how bad the situation was, but he somehow gave the people hope. John describes what the city was like. He said, "Once our city was the happiest place on earth. Now there's nowhere so sad. The people used to buzz around the forum like bees around their hive, and everyone said how lucky we were that there were so many of us. Now look at us. The hive is deserted. Fear has chased us away like smoke chasing bees." So no one was in the forum, he said. Where there had been a constant river of people, one or two forlorn figures were hurrying through with their heads down. John goes on to say that free men sit inside shackled with their slaves. Whenever they think they can talk to someone safely, they ask, "Who got taken away today? Who's been arrested? Who's been killed? How did it go? What happened?" Well, the story had a happy ending. The bishop of Antioch himself successfully pleaded with Theodosius to spare the city. But no one ever forgot those dark days and the sermons that made John famous across the Roman Empire. In fact, they made him too famous. He was chosen as Bishop of Constantinople, the imperial capital, based on the fame he had earned in Antioch. In Constantinople, he had a miserable time, and he ultimately died in exile. Antioch, meanwhile, was not through turning out famous theologians. John Chrysostom's friend, Theodore of Mopsuestia, wrote important works still read today, but his reputation in later centuries had some serious ups and downs. Stories associated him with a younger theologian who was destined to be much more influential, Nestorius. Nestorius was trained in Antioch, and he was respected for his learning, so much so that he was made Bishop of Constantinople in 428. That was when things started to go wrong for him. Nestorius told his flock that they shouldn't call Mary Mother of God. She was Mother of the Christ, but she was Mother of the human nature only. This separation of the natures did not go over well. It provoked a big battle in the church, and under the leadership of Cyril of Alexandria, the Council of Ephesus in 431 condemned Nestorius. He retired to a monastery in Antioch, but was eventually exiled to the Oasis in Egypt. Many Christians in the East, including Antioch, never accepted the condemnation of Nestorius. To this day, he is considered a saint in several Eastern Christian traditions. Partly because of these ongoing disputes, Antioch began to lose some of its influence in the larger church. But the city was still the great metropolis of the East in the year 500. Then, in 525, a huge fire hit the city. Fires were common in ancient times. This one was mild by comparison to some. It wrecked the center of the city, but it looked as though the city would recover. But only a few months later, a titanic earthquake reduced much of the city to rubble. It happened when most people were inside at dinner. Historians say that 250,000 people died. Fires broke out. Looting followed. The city had just begun to recover when 2.5 years later, another earthquake tore through it, flattening what was left. Once again, the city started to rebuild, though archaeologists say it was on a much smaller scale. But then in 540, the Persian army took the city and burned it to the ground with the usual pillage and massacres. And then 2 years later came the plague. And then came 3 more earthquakes. And the Persians came back and burned the place again. There was little left of Antioch by the time the conquering Arabs came in. Antioch surrendered easily, partly because it had no way of defending itself, and partly because the Arabs made surrendering easy. Just pay your tax and get on with your lives, and we'll leave you alone. The population remained mostly Christian for centuries, and the city would be conquered by Western European Christians in the Crusades. It's now a medium-sized city, Antakya, in the southeastern corner of Turkey, with little left above ground to show that it was once the leading city of the East. Today, there are several patriarchs of Antioch. The Syriac Orthodox Church is led by a patriarch of Antioch, who lives in Damascus. There is a Melkite patriarch of Antioch, also in Damascus. There is a Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch, again in Damascus. There is a Maronite Patriarch of Antioch in Lebanon. There is a Syriac Catholic Patriarch of Antioch in Beirut. But there are no Patriarchs of Antioch in Antioch. I hope you've enjoyed this third episode of the third season of The Way of the Fathers, and if you did, I ask you to consider making a donation to help us. We're entirely listener-funded, so we're utterly dependent on you. So please go now to our donation form at catholicculture.org/donate/audio. We're grateful for anything you can give. And remember, we pray for our contributors and our listeners every day.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings, Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.